They looked at me like I didn't belong, and maybe I didn't. But as I stood there, alone at my sister's wedding, the cold stares of Martinez Blackwell's family weighing me down, I realized one thing: I didn't need to belong to their world. I just needed to find my own. Before starting this story, if you are listening from USA, please leave a comment with number 9. And if you are from another country, please leave the name of your lovely country. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to listen to more stories. It had been over a year since I last set foot in the United States, and as I stepped off the plane at Kennedy International, the weight of being home again hit me in ways I hadn't expected. The familiar hum of airport chatter and the acrid scent of overpriced coffee filled the air, but it all felt foreign to me now. I had spent the past 2 years in conflict zones, coordinating relief efforts, and somehow, the world I once knew felt distant. I'm Maevy Carter, 32 years old, and I had spent more time in places that most people couldn't find on a map than I ever had in my own country. My work had always been my life, my identity. I was a humanitarian aid worker, specialized in emergency medical coordination in war-torn regions. But coming back to New York, to my family, was not the same as it once was. It wasn't just the change in me. It was the change in how I viewed everything I had left behind. I had no idea how to navigate the world I'd been away from for so long. Kalia, my younger sister, was getting married in the Grand Palms Resort, an extravagant venue nestled just outside the city. It had all the trappings of a fairy tale wedding: white roses, crystal chandeliers, and more champagne than a small country could drink in a month. I had received the invitation while coordinating a field hospital setup after a major earthquake in Ecuador. The timing couldn't have been worse, but missing it wasn't an option. Kalia was my sister, my blood, and after years of avoiding family events due to my work, I had to be there for her. As I stepped into the reception hall, I felt all eyes on me. The hush that followed my entrance was palpable. The room, full of wealthy guests from Martinez Blackwell's side of the family, seemed to freeze for a moment. Their stares were cold, clinical, as if I were some alien species that didn't belong in their world. They whispered behind their wine glasses, their glances like daggers. And then there was Martinez, standing at the center of it all, his broad grin plastered on his face, clearly trying to play the part of the perfect groom. I knew this would happen. Martinez's family was everything I had never been: wealthy, polished, and successful by their own standards. I had spent the last several years working in places where survival was the goal, not luxury. I had worked tirelessly to save lives in war zones, putting my own life on the line every day. But here, in this glittering ballroom, I was nothing more than a curiosity, an outsider to a world I once thought I belonged to. As I walked further into the room, I saw my parents, standing with Martinez's parents. My mother, Maria, spotted me first and rushed over, her arms open wide. Her hug was tight, almost suffocating, and as she pulled away, her eyes scanned me critically. "Maevy, you've lost weight. Honey, and look at your skin. We could have fixed you up with a spa day if you had come home earlier," she said, her voice dripping with both concern and a hint of disappointment. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Mom, ever the picture of perfection, had never understood my choices. She would never understand why I chose to spend my life in places like Sudan or Syria instead of living a normal, comfortable life in the States. My life had always been about helping those who had nothing, but to her, nothing was more important than appearances. I forced a smile. "I'm just happy to be here." "Mom, it's fine," I replied. But deep down, it wasn't fine. As I stood there, amid the glitzy crowd, I felt the sting of every disapproving glance, every whispered judgment. I wasn't part of their world, and I didn't know how to make them understand that I didn't want to be. I could feel the weight of my mother's disapproval before she even spoke. The moment I entered our childhood home, the first thing Maria did was pull me into a tight embrace, but not without a side comment. "Maevy, you've lost so much weight. You really should have come back sooner. We could have fixed you up with a spa day to make you look presentable for the wedding." I forced a smile, knowing full well that what she meant wasn't just about my appearance, it was about everything that made me, me. Maria didn't see the purpose in my work. She couldn't understand why I chose to spend my life in places like Ethiopia or Yemen rather than build a career in finance or marketing, or marry into the world of comfortable, stable wealth, to her. Kalia had done things the right way graduating college, starting a career in marketing, dating someone from a good family, and now she was marrying Liam Blackwell, the heir to one of the East Coast's largest banking families. It was everything my mother had hoped for me, everything she'd imagined when she'd raised us. "Mom, I'm fine," I said, unpacking my duffel bag in the corner of the small bedroom that had once been mine. Now, it looked more like an office. The once familiar walls felt suffocating, reminding me of everything I didn't fit into. But my mother wasn't done. "You don't understand. Maevy, it's a big event, and we can't have you showing up looking like—" She paused, glancing over at my clothes, my worn boots, the practical, utilitarian nature of my attire, "like this," she finished, as though it was some sort of sin. I let out a soft sigh. "Mom, I don't need a date. I'm perfectly capable of attending a wedding alone." Her sigh was heavy with disappointment. "But everyone will have someone," she murmured. "Martinez's family is very traditional. What will they think?" I could feel the sting of her words. My mother's concerns were valid in her world, in her eyes, but they didn't make sense to me. I wasn't looking for validation through a man or social status. I wasn't sure I had ever been. My life had never been about pleasing anyone but myself. Yet, deep down, I knew it wasn't just about the superficial stuff. It was about the deep, ingrained belief that I had chosen a path that didn't fit the mold. "Mom, they'll think I'm a grown woman who doesn't need a man on her arm to validate her existence," I said, though I knew it was more complicated than that. Her concerns weren't entirely unfounded. From the few interactions I'd had with Martinez's family, I understood they valued appearances above all else. And a woman like me, unmarried, childless, with a career in humanitarian aid was an anomaly to them, an embarrassment. Maybe, later, I overheard Kalia talking to Liam in the kitchen. She was trying to keep her voice low, but I heard every word. "Yes, she's finally here. She looks well, but you know how she is. Mom's trying to help with her appearance. But no, she didn't bring anyone. Honestly, I just hope she doesn't say anything controversial to your parents. You know how passionate she gets about her causes." The words sliced through me. Kalia, my own sister, was hoping I wouldn't say anything that would make her new in-laws uncomfortable. I had always supported Kalia unconditionally, always been her ally, but now it felt like she was choosing her new life over the relationship we'd once shared. I stood there, trying to push the hurt away, but the sting was real. I'd always felt like an outsider in my own family, but this was a reminder that the gap between us was widening by the minute. I could have left. I could have made up some emergency and returned to my team, where I was needed, where I was respected. But running away would only mean running from the problem. No, I was here because Kalia was my sister, and this day meant something to her. Despite the hurt, I wanted to be there for her. The moment I stepped into the Grand Palms Resort, it felt as though the air shifted. Everything around me was pristine, polished, and almost suffocating in its perfection. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, their light bouncing off gleaming marble floors. Kalia had always dreamed of a wedding like this, lavish, grand, and flawless, but to me, it felt like a world that didn't belong to me, a world where I was the odd one out. I scanned the room, instantly aware of the whispers. Some were barely audible, others not even trying to hide their curiosity. I was an anomaly, Kalia's sister, the one who didn't fit the mold. The guests, all dressed in expensive suits and sparkling gowns, gave me polite smiles, but their eyes were a different story. I could feel them sizing me up, the judgment behind their polite greetings like a weight pressing against my chest. Martinez's family was here in full force. I knew what they valued: wealth, status, appearance, but nothing in this room seemed to matter more than who was wearing the right brand, who had the right connection. As I moved through the crowd, trying to find my place, I felt like I was a ghost walking among the living. There was Liam, standing with his parents, laughing and talking with their high society friends. He looked so comfortable in this world, so natural, and it was clear that he belonged. Kalia stood beside him, glowing with happiness, and for a moment, I couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. She had everything they had always dreamed of for her. She was the perfect daughter, the one who made all the right choices. And then there was me, unmarried, childless, and constantly drawn into a life of chaos and sacrifice, trying to make a difference in a world that didn't understand or care. I finally found my seat, tucked away at the far end of the room. It wasn't a mistake. The seat had been chosen for me. An afterthought, as though my presence here wasn't really necessary. The chair beside me was empty, and I could see the other guests clustered in pairs, laughing, dancing, sharing stories. The contrast was so stark it almost stung. I felt like I was on the outside looking in, excluded, not just physically but emotionally. As I sat there, I overheard snippets of conversations, people discussing vacations, business ventures, and family legacies. They weren't talking about anything important. It was all just noise, nothing like the life I'd been living for the past few years. I wasn't sure if I was more annoyed or saddened by the emptiness of it all. I had seen too much, been through too many real, life or death situations to care about things like designer brands or social status. But here, in this perfect artificial bubble, it was the only thing that seemed to matter. A part of me wanted to leave, to step outside, breathe in the fresh air, and just walk away from it all. But then I caught Kalia's eye across the room, and she smiled at me, and for a second, I remembered why I was here. This was her day, and despite everything, I wanted to be there for her. The reception continued around me, but I felt like I was standing still, frozen in a moment of discomfort. I watched as couples paired up to dance, laughing, chatting, their lives so neatly wrapped in shiny, perfectly tied packages. Meanwhile, I sat alone at the far end of the ballroom, feeling every unspoken judgment in the room. It wasn't just the whispers, it was the way they looked at me, the way their eyes seemed to ask, "What's wrong with her?" And then, as if the universe itself had decided to add insult to injury, Liam's mother, Constance, approached. She was the epitome of everything I wasn't, dressed in a custom-tailored designer suit. Her every movement screamed wealth and status, and the air seemed to part for her as she glided across the room. "Maevy, dear," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How lovely to finally meet you. I've heard so much about your, charity work." Her tone was polite, but there was an undertone of condescension that I couldn't ignore. I forced a smile and extended my hand. "Yes, I coordinate international humanitarian aid," I said, my voice steady despite the sharp sting of her words. She gave a polite nod, as though my answer didn't quite fit into the narrative she had in her mind. "How admirable," she said, her eyes scanning my outfit. "You know, it's so inspiring to meet someone who helps in such, let's say, unusual ways. It's all so noble, don't you think?" The word noble hung in the air like a piece of stale candy, too sweet to be real. It wasn't admiration I saw in her eyes, but rather the faintest trace of mockery. I could tell she saw me as some misguided idealist, someone who worked in the dusty corners of the world while the rest of her guests built their lives around appearances and money. Martinez's family valued success in stock portfolios, not lives saved. I nodded, trying to keep my cool. I've always believed that making a difference in the world is worth the sacrifice. She let out a small, patronizing chuckle. "Of course. Dear, how selfless." She paused, clearly scanning the room to see if anyone had been paying attention to this exchange. She was already preparing to move on. But then she took a step closer and whispered, "I'm sure your work is very challenging, but really, don't you feel that a woman your age should have other priorities, a family, perhaps a husband?" The words landed like a slap, not because they were new to me, but because they had come from someone who would never understand the kind of life I had chosen. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, Kalia appeared beside me, her eyes scanning the room nervously as she caught Constance's words. She forced a smile. "Alex, don't mind Constance. She means well, but she's, well, from a different world," she said, her voice apologetic. I swallowed my frustration, trying to mask the pain with a forced smile. "It's fine," I replied, my voice flat. Kalia squeezed my arm gently, her eyes pleading with me to let it go. She was caught between two worlds, her new life with Martinez and the life she had known with me, with us. Her whole family was judging me, and she didn't know how to stand up for me without risking her place in their world. But as the conversation drifted away, I realized something. It wasn't just Constance who didn't understand me, it was Kalia too. She had chosen to stand by her new family's values, even if it meant I had to be the one left behind. The thought stung, but it wasn't new. I had been second place for most of my life. The moment of judgment wasn't just a quiet exchange with Constance. It was the realization that my place in Kalia's life, and in this world, was constantly in question, and no matter how hard I tried to fit in, it would never be enough. I was still fuming from my conversation with Constance when the reception took an unexpected turn. The music played softly in the background, and guests continued to chat. Oblivious to the tension bubbling beneath the surface, I had tried to retreat into myself, but the sting of being treated like an outsider in my own family was too much. It wasn't the first time I had felt out of place, but today, it felt like the final straw. That was when I noticed him, Stellan Fitzgerald, standing by the bar, observing me from across the room. I hadn't paid much attention to him earlier, but now his presence seemed to take on a different significance. Unlike the rest of the crowd, he wasn't looking at me with judgment or curiosity. His gaze was focused, thoughtful, as if he saw something in me that the others didn't. I glanced away, trying to shake the feeling of being under a microscope, but to my surprise, Richard walked over to me, his approach calm and deliberate. The air seemed to shift as he drew nearer, and I felt a mix of emotions: confusion, apprehension, and a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was different. "Maevy!" "Right," he said, extending his hand. His voice was warm but not overbearing, genuine but respectful. I shook his hand, feeling a strange sense of relief that someone was treating me like a person and not an oddity. "Yes, Maevy Carter. And you're Stellan Fitzgerald, Martinez's uncle." He nodded, offering a small smile. "I've heard a lot about you, I must say. I admire what you do. Not many people would choose to dedicate their lives to helping others in such challenging places." I was taken aback. Richard seemed genuinely interested, not just in my work, but in me as a person. It was a stark contrast to the way I had been treated by most of the other guests, and especially by Martinez's family. His words were not those of polite curiosity, but of real respect. "Thank you," I said, struggling to hide my surprise. "It's not easy, but it's worth it. Helping people when they need it most, there's nothing like it." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "I understand that. In my line of work, we deal with logistics for international relief operations. I've been to some of those same places you've worked, although I'm sure my experiences are nothing like yours." It struck me then that Richard wasn't just some wealthy businessman like the others here. He had a depth to him that most of these people lacked. I had heard his name before he was known in certain circles for his work with humanitarian aid organizations and international businesses, but no one ever spoke about him like they did about the rest of Martinez's family. His status wasn't built on wealth or reputation, but on something more meaningful. I found myself talking freely with him, telling him about some of the hardest missions I had been on, the lives we had saved, the challenges we faced with limited resources. Richard listened intently, asking insightful questions, and when I finished talking, he just nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Maevy," he said, "there are too many people in the world who don't understand the value of what you do. They think success is measured by the size of your bank account or your social status. But people like you, people who go into the heart of crisis zones and save lives, those are the real heroes. The world is a better place because of your work." His words hit me harder than I expected. Here was a man who not only understood but respected what I did. For the first time that day, I felt a shift in my perspective. The constant judgment and condescension from everyone else seemed distant, irrelevant. As Richard continued speaking, I realized that his recognition of me wasn't about appearances or status. It was about genuine acknowledgement of the work I had done, the sacrifices I had made, and the lives I had touched. His respect wasn't a formality, it was rooted in shared understanding, and it made me feel seen, in a way that no one else had. Just then, the music shifted, and I saw Martinez's mother, Constance, glance over at us, her brow furrowed in confusion. The awkwardness in the room was palpable as she watched us, but Richard remained unfazed. He had turned the tables, and suddenly, I wasn't the outsider anymore. Before I could process the significance of this moment, Richard excused himself and turned to the crowd, raising his voice just enough for the people around us to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, commanding attention with a calm authority, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone in this room whose work has impacted more lives than we could ever truly understand. Maevy Carter, who has saved hundreds of lives in regions of the world most of us will never see. Her dedication is nothing short of extraordinary." The room went silent. For a moment, no one knew how to react. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but it wasn't from anxiety, it was from the overwhelming realization that Stellan Fitzgerald, a man who didn't have to care, had just made me visible to everyone who had dismissed me as nothing more than an oddity. And as the silence lingered, I couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude, because in that single moment, Richard had changed everything. The silence in the room was almost unbearable, but as Stellan Fitzgerald finished his speech, something began to shift. The guests who had been huddled in their cliques, whispering behind their glasses, started to look at me differently. At first, there were just curious glances, but then it became something more. It was as though his words had peeled back a veil, revealing something the others hadn't even considered. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, some questioning, some intrigued, and others, I hoped, a little embarrassed for how they'd treated me before. I stood there, still processing what had just happened, when I saw Kalia. Her eyes were wide, her face a mixture of surprise and something else, maybe regret, or perhaps just confusion. She had never fully understood my path, had never really seen the weight of the work I did. Now, it seemed like she was seeing me for the first time, or at least seeing the value of what I had spent the last few years doing. As I stood by the bar, the conversation shifted, but it was clear that I had become the subject. Guests who had barely acknowledged me earlier now began to approach me one by one. Some of them, like Martinez's cousin, were asking the same shallow questions, pretending to care now that they knew my work had some sort of prestige attached to it. But there were others, like Dr. Roberts, who truly seemed to want to understand. He came over with a genuine smile, extending his hand. "Maevy, it's wonderful to finally speak with you. I heard about the operations you ran in Syria last year. Truly remarkable work. The way you coordinated evacuations during such a chaotic time, it's inspiring." I blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Dr. Roberts. It wasn't easy, but we managed." His eyes gleamed with admiration, and he leaned in slightly, as though we were sharing a private conversation in the middle of a crowded room. "You know," he said, lowering his voice just a bit, "it's not often we get to speak with someone who actually changes the course of events. Most people just talk about making a difference. Though you're out there, doing it." I felt a sense of pride stir within me, one that had been dormant for so long. The recognition was welcome, but it didn't come from the people I'd hoped it would. The others continued to whisper, but it no longer mattered. I had been seen for who I was, and it felt more powerful than anything I had ever experienced. But just as I started to relax into the moment, I saw Liam's parents approach. Constance, always the poised figure, looked at me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maevy, dear," she said, "I must say, your work is so unique." The emphasis on the word unique wasn't lost on me. She had clearly done a mental backpedal, trying to reconcile the humanitarian work I did with the picture she had of me before. Robert, standing beside her, gave me a tight smile, as if he was trying to convey something like approval, but was still uncomfortable with the entire exchange. "Yes," he added. "We've heard a lot about you. It's good to see someone so dedicated to their causes." He didn't seem convinced, but he had at least acknowledged me in a way that was worlds apart from how I had been treated before. I wanted to be gracious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that their newfound interest wasn't about me. It was about the social capital that had just been thrust upon me. They didn't care about the people I had helped or the lives I had saved. They cared about how my work could reflect well on them now that Stellan Fitzgerald had publicly acknowledged it. Despite all of that, a small part of me felt satisfied, vindicated. Even the way they had treated me before felt like a distant memory now, overshadowed by this moment of recognition. But I couldn't ignore the fact that, had Richard not spoken up, I would still be the invisible sister, the one who didn't fit in with the polished, perfect world of Martinez's family. As the night went on, the conversations became less awkward, but I didn't get lost in them. I had been seen not just by Richard, but by others who would never have noticed me before. Kalia came to me later, her expression softer now. She squeezed my arm gently. "I'm sorry. Maevy, I didn't realize how much you were carrying. I should have been more supportive, but you've done amazing things." For the first time, I felt like she wasn't just saying it because she had to. There was a trace of respect in her voice, and I realized it wasn't too late for us. I wasn't sure where our relationship would go from here, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like Kalia might understand. But then, as I stepped back to observe the scene again, I saw Liam in the distance, whispering to Constance. He was looking in my direction, but his eyes weren't filled with admiration or respect. They were full of something else, maybe judgment, maybe pity. And in that moment, I knew that despite all the shifts in perception, the battle to be seen for who I truly was had only just begun. The night had gone on, and despite the residual discomfort I still felt, something had shifted in me. I wasn't sure if it was the recognition from Stellan Fitzgerald or the softer words from Kalia, but a quiet resolve began to take root. I was still the same person I had always been, a humanitarian aid worker, a woman who found purpose in helping those who needed it most, but now I could see myself through a different lens. No longer the outsider at Kalia's wedding, no longer trying to fit into a world that wasn't mine. When I stepped outside to get some air, the cool night breeze hit my face, bringing with it a sense of clarity. The wedding lights twinkled in the distance, but they seemed far less important now. In the span of a few hours, I had moved from being invisible to being acknowledged, not just by a few people, but by Richard, and by extension, the guests in that room who had once looked at me with curiosity and disdain. My work, what I did, the lives I helped save had been acknowledged for the first time in a way that meant something. I stood there, leaning against the cool stone of the balcony, breathing in the night air. It wasn't just about being recognized by others anymore. It was about me recognizing my own worth. For so long, I had lived in the shadows of others' expectations, living up to their ideals of success and beauty, trying to please people who would never understand the value of my work. I had allowed myself to shrink, to doubt my own choices, and let those doubts weigh me down, but no more. I thought of the people I had helped in Syria, the children who had been evacuated through the chaos of war, the families who had found safety in places that seemed impossible. I thought about the countless nights spent in makeshift hospitals, working tirelessly to save lives in places where the odds were stacked against us. Those were the moments that defined me, not the superficial approval of strangers or the empty praise of people who didn't know what it meant to make real sacrifices. I wasn't just a charity case to be pitied. I wasn't a disappointment because I hadn't followed the expected path. I was someone who had made a difference. And that was enough. That was everything. When I went back inside, I felt different. The awkwardness had not completely disappeared, but I wasn't the same person who had entered the wedding hours earlier. I was no longer trying to fit in, to prove myself to people who would never understand my choices. I was standing tall, owning my identity for the first time in a long time. I didn't care about how others saw me. I had nothing to prove to anyone. Kalia caught my eye from across the room, and this time, her smile was genuine. It wasn't just a polite gesture. She had seen me, truly seen me, and for once, I felt like I had finally earned her respect. I didn't know what would come next for our relationship, but I could feel the change, and I knew it was for the better. As the night wore on, I found myself laughing, not because I was trying to fit in, but because I was truly at ease with myself. The whispers no longer mattered. The sideways glances didn't sting anymore. I wasn't just a bystander in my own life. I was a participant in the story that I had written, and that felt good. It felt freeing. For the first time, I wasn't looking for validation from anyone else. I knew who I was, and that was more than enough. When I left the reception later that night, the weight of the world didn't feel as heavy. I had found a new confidence, a new respect for myself, and that was worth more than all the accolades in the world. As I drove back to my temporary apartment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The next few weeks were a blur of emails, phone calls, and reports from the field. Despite the chaos that often consumed my work, there was a sense of calm that had settled in my heart. I had come to a realization that had been simmering in the back of my mind for years, but I had never been able to fully acknowledge it until now I was on the right path. That moment at the wedding, when Stellan Fitzgerald publicly acknowledged my work, had been the spark. But it was my own transformation that had truly changed everything. I had always lived for the approval of others, especially my family. But now, I realized that seeking validation from people who didn't understand my choices only held me back. I had spent so much of my life trying to fit into a world that didn't reflect my values, my work, or my passion. I had tried to convince myself that I needed their approval to feel whole, to feel important, but I didn't need any of that anymore. I had always known deep down that my path was different from Kalia's, but now I understood that the difference wasn't a flaw, it was what made me who I was. I had a purpose, one that was far more meaningful than the fleeting moments of validation from those who couldn't see beyond their own limited perspectives. My work was saving lives, creating hope in places where despair was the only thing that seemed certain. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just accepting it, I was embracing it. I spent the following days reflecting on the conversations I had at the wedding. Some of the guests' words had been dismissive, even insulting, but now they seemed insignificant. The more important conversations, the ones that mattered, were with the people who truly understood what it meant to dedicate your life to something larger than yourself. People like Richard, who saw the value in my work, not because it fit into their neat little world of wealth and status, but because it made a tangible difference. He had recognized me for what I truly was, a dedicated, passionate person committed to a cause much bigger than the trappings of high society. As I drove back to my apartment after a long day, I felt lighter. The weight of the judgment that had once hung over me was gone. Kalia's newfound respect for me was a welcome change, but I knew it didn't matter nearly as much as the respect I had finally given myself. I wasn't waiting for anyone to tell me I was doing the right thing anymore. I knew it in my bones. I took a deep breath and smiled, the familiar sense of fulfillment flooding my chest for the first time. I wasn't questioning whether my life choices were valid. I wasn't looking for approval. I had found my peace in the work I did, in the lives I touched, and in the person I was becoming. It was enough. And that night, as I lay in my bed, I realized that for the first time in years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true fulfillment comes from embracing our authentic selves, even when the world around us doesn't always understand or accept our choices. Maevy's journey highlights the importance of finding value in our work and passions, regardless of external validation, in a society that often prioritizes status and appearances. Maevy learned to appreciate the impact of her actions and to stand proudly in her own truth. Her story encourages us all to trust our path, no matter how unconventional it may seem, and to seek fulfillment from within rather than relying on others' approval. It also speaks to the need for empathy and understanding in our relationships, urging us to support one another without judgment, especially when others make different choices. Maevy's shift from feeling judged to being recognized for her dedication teaches us the power of not just recognition, but self-recognition. It's a reminder that sometimes the most valuable acknowledgement comes from within, and that's where true confidence is born. This story is a work of fiction created for educational and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended to attack or defame any individual, family, or organization. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. If this story moved you or sparked a thought, please let us know by commenting below. Your likes, shares, and subscriptions help us create more stories that inspire and entertain. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching and being part of our community.